So this is how your native plant garden looks like when you planted it. You got your conifer tree and you got some shrubs and things, and you're very pleased with yourself and it looks pretty good. But a little bit later, some of the shrubbery is getting a little out of hand, grabbing you when you walk by. It's a bit too much. So you're going to go in and delete some of your shrubs. So now it's looking good again. You got your big tree grew up, you've left a couple of the big shrubs, and you've planted lots of little guys to amuse you on the forest floor. But even then, as things continue to grow, it can get to be a bit much. So finally, we are left with only a couple of the shrubs that we began with and our great big trees, which have shaded out almost all the other stuff. And now I'm going to continue to underplant with sword ferns and other woodland goodies, and there's no weeding and life is good. Just so you know, there is no steady state gardening. It's really something you adjust to as it grows up. You keep going in about every 5 to 10 years and making adjustments. And one of the things you'll be doing is removals. Mainly, you'll be removing invasive plants, by which I mean, ivy gets in and blackberries get in. And sometimes your native plants have a whole bunch of babies that are going to take over and fill in and just, make a mess of things. So you have to be on top of it and constantly go out and judge your property and decide what needs to stay and what needs to go. There's a lot of different ways you can remove plants. You can cut them to the ground if it's like an evergreen Doug fir that's seeded in and you don't want a Doug fir there, you just cut it to the ground, it's dead. It can't sprout back. Other times, it would be something like a, little maple tree flew in and took up, and you actually have to dig it up because if you cut it to the ground, it'll just keep coming back. You want to dig it up with a straight shank spade, not a shovel. And there are other things we'll go over what you can use to get these plants out. It's always better to get them when they're young, but you need to go in and get them when they're old once it has become overgrown. Then there's a thing called a weed wrench, which costs $200 that some people use on native plant sites to get rid of unwanted plants like Scotch broom. And when you have some really bad players, by which I mean the Japanese knotweed, you can use the glyphosate injection system. It's an injection, and you can inject your unwanted woody brush with Roundup or glyphosate, which, although it is a poison, is relatively, it's not fail-safe, but it's fool-resistant. And ecological restoration people, when they're going to bend their organic moral ethics, will do so for glyphosate because when it touches the ground, it's inactivated and can't kill anything next to it. Worm can climb right through that soil and not be hurt. I personally use glyphosate or Roundup in an empty rubber cement jar. That only costs $1.50. And also, if you get on top of stuff early because you hate chemicals, you want to remove your invasives when they're only 4 inches tall. Some of them can be very heavily rooted, and that's when you use a pair of pliers. English ivy. Public enemy number 1. Don't let English ivy get into your woods because it has the capacity to smother out all the native vegetation. They call it a green desert. And even if you have it in your ordinary garden, you want to dig it up using something I call a baby mattock and just chisel it out of your ground, rolling it up like a rug as you do so and bundling it off. You can get entire yards clear of this. Unfortunately, when you get to the mother lode root, sometimes you have to cut that and paint it with Roundup so it doesn't go right back up your tree next year. We'll talk about that more later. Another common invader, almost anything that seeds itself can be a common invader of your native plant garden or your green belt. English laurel tends to seed in, and it's considered bad news. Here again, you need to pull them out. Actually, so this is a little trick. In the spring, thousands of little seeds pop up in your garden, and they're like little big leaf maples and little laurels and other little trees. And you can leave all the little trees and shrubs till the end of the year, and probably 90% of them will die on their own. And then you hand pull or plier pull what's left. There's no need to get them all at the beginning of the year. When you see that carpet of laurels or that carpet of big leaf maple seedlings, don't panic. Wait till the end of the season before you go after them. And nature will take care of most of the babies, just like they tend to do. Another bad player in the Pacific Northwest wild spaces is English holly. The birds eat these berries. Drop a pre-fertilized seed packet into your native plant garden. Up comes this thorny little bush, which outcompetes our native vegetation. And you want to be on the lookout for those babies, too. And do not put up with them. They're so cute when they're little. Ha! Cotoneaster, also another plant that has babies, will seed in. When you finally realize that that's what it is that's coming up, suffer it not. Get your pliers or your pokey tool and get that baby out. And if you can't hand prune or plier prune, this is what I mean by a spade. It's better than a shovel because your foot power goes straight down as opposed to being diverted. Shovels are good for scooping. Spades are good for digging stuff out because you can actually jump straight down on it and get down and get the root. So you've been digging and you still can't get it. Then you go get the pry bar. My husband calls it the tool of ignorance. It's a great big heavy metal bar, and you will learn the amazing power of leverage. And I'll never forget seeing what a pry bar can do. And you can amaze your friends and family, and you're just going to have to take my word for it. This will get stuff out of the ground that a shovel and brute force won't. After you dig a hole under it, you get a lever. In this case, it is a piece of firewood. Anything lying around the yard, a big rock, will do. And I think there was a famous person who said, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum, and I will move the world. And it's true. You get a lever arm long enough, and you can pry out just about anything. The pry bar. You know, if you don't have one, you can go rent one. Gotta love those rental stores. They rent you everything. And the power of leverage, I believe, is also at work with this weed wrench. It's a thing that looks like this. I suppose you can Google that up. And this is used on group projects to get rid of things like Scotch broom, which are hard to dig out. And it just kind of grabs hold of it, and then you pull back, and the arm grasps it and then pulls it out. And then there's the JK injection system used by ecological restorers. There's some really nasty plants out there that refuse to die. And especially on steep slopes where you can't be digging and tearing up the soil, sometimes it's better to inject the invader with Roundup, which gets translocated throughout the system of the plant and kills just it. It doesn't pass through the soil to get anything else. This thing is not cheap. This is $600, but you do sort of get to feel like a cowgirl if you got one. This is a system I use. I get a rubber cement bottle, get all the rubber cement out of it, which is a neat trick. Then I put in concentrated Roundup. It's about 18%, and then I add some water. And when I run across invasive plants like holly, laurel, big leaf maple, and salmonberry, I cut it with my hand pruner about 1 inch off of the ground. I put my hand pruner over it. Then I turn and get my Roundup bottle out of my little nail pouch. And then I paint the cut stem. You need to wear gloves. You need to wear glasses. Don't wash it out in a trout stream. And you want to do this in the summer, and it will get sucked into that root system and kill just that plant. This is me getting rid of the rubber cement out of my rubber cement jar. I actually have an implement that I got off the internet that lasts longer than this. This the brush kind of rusts out. But you're not going to be using this a lot. You're just going to use this once every 10 years. And so this will do just fine for the meantime. And you want to paint that stem. You really only have to paint the outer ring of the stem, but since it's small enough, you paint that whole stem. It'll turn a nice bright yellow when the poison is on it. When I'm doing like a whole field of blackberries, I only cut 3 stems, 1, 2, 3, and then I paint them 1, 2, 3. And then I cut 3 stems, 1, 2, 3, and then I paint them 1, 2, 3. Because the second you turn your eyes away, you will lose track of where that stem is. And it's tedious, but so is cutting down the same blackberry bush for 30 years in a row. And it doesn't disturb the soil and the soil organisms like ripping it out would. So in some ways, it's a little easier on the environment. If you really, really hate using chemicals, and I wouldn't fault you for that, then you go back to section 1, the spade, or 2, the pry bar, or 3, the weed wrench. So there are other things that you can do now that you've gone out and you've taken out all the invasive plants and the ones that are extraneous, which means babies that you didn't really want in your garden. Other things that will make it look better is to take out the vines. Divine. We have a nice native wild blackberry plant, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's great up on a mountain when you go hunting for wild blackberries, but it's mucking up the good looks of your native plant garden outside your front door, so you want to rip that out. They're little ankle busters, I call them. Anything else that's kind of stringy, like the wild strawberry or the honeysuckle, this is just to make things look good. Remember when I told you about those subconscious beliefs that you had that no native plants should die? I want you to remember that your native plant garden is just for you to enjoy. And if there's a native plant in it that's upsetting you, even subconsciously, it's perfectly okay for you to take it out, knowing in your heart that it is living someplace else happily and thriving. Another thing you want to do is take out dead leaves, twigs, and little branchlets that have fallen out of your conifer. These are things that nature loves. Your bugs, your birds, your bees, they love all this junk that falls out of plants and into your garden. And in other parts of your garden, you're going to let it be kind of a mess because nature loves a mess. But right near the front door, when you have this native plant garden and everybody's coming in, for Thanksgiving, you want to keep it a little tidier. And some of the things you can do is take out at least the biggest dead leaves and the biggest chunks of twigs and the big pieces of windfall. Sometimes you can just shake it through the branches so that it lies on the ground instead of is hung up. And I need to tell you about ferns, too. They really are good at collecting big leaf maple leaves. So you want to hand rake out your ferns. And if you're feeling particularly anal retentive, you know that you can cut your sword ferns down in March and let all the new fronds grow up. And they won't have any dead fronds around them in the summer. Oh, this might be an ethical challenge for people who want to leave the dead fronds for, say, bumblebees, but really like them. But if you clean up your forest floor or your native plant area, you don't want to leave a bunch of bare ground. So you want to replace all this junk that you took out with something that looks a little better, and that would be the mulch that you get from arborists. When arborists take down a conifer and run it through the chipper, they make something which really mimics the forest floor. And if you get them, you can split a pile of mulch with your neighbor. After you clean the forest floor, it's good to mulch with those arborist chips to keep, all the weeds like shotweed and fireweed. And, I guess fireweed's a native. Yeah, well, we're not going to have it in your garden. At least not in the front. We're going to have that someplace else, like in the forest. But a lot of, dandelions and things like that, you don't want them to get a foothold on your beautiful forest floor. So that's why we put in these arborist chips. Be sure to include a bunch of ferns in your garden. They're nice lower story plants that aren't going to get too huge so that you can't see out your window. And they really give it an ooh-ah look. I'm particularly fond of the Maidenhair Fern. And it's really tough as nails. Even if it dies in the heat, it'll come back. It kind of wants to grow on bank that's dripping water, but it'll grow, a lot of tough places. And deer ferns are really cute. They're little teeny tiny ferns, and they're very tidy, and they have these little fiddleheads that come up in the spring, and everybody loves a deer fern. And sword ferns, they're the workhorse of the garden. They occur just naturally in gardens all over the Pacific Northwest, and they're great to design with. If you take out a big shrub in your landscape that finally got too huge, you want to plug that place with a sword fern. They take sun, they take shade, they take drought, they take water, they take everything. Sword ferns. They're evergreen. They don't get too big. The bumblebees like to hide underneath them. And they have great fiddleheads that come up in the spring. Sword fern, one of my favorite plants. Unlike the lady fern. Lady fern's not the same as a maidenhair fern, and I consider lady ferns a detraction in almost every garden. They also show up naturally in everybody's garden. And they're not bad looking, except in the fall when the fronds turn yellow and then they get hung up inside of other plants and look pretty wretched. So just personally, on a personal level, I would personally recommend that you do not allow lady ferns to exist in your yard. I hate them. I hate them. I hate them. I hate them. Maybe you don't. And maybe you want some lady ferns. And I guess that's up to you.